It's time to get sexy on Secular Sexuality.
Hello and welcome to Secular Sexuality, the ACA show that wants to take you on a magic carpet ride. Joining me, of course, this week is Bianca.
Hello, everyone.
And joining us for the first time is my fellow therapist and colleague, Grace Wood. Grace works as an LPC intern with a special interest in identity development and psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. So whether you're currently thinking, oh, I've always been curious about that, or what the hell is he talking about? Now's a great time to give us a call with all of your psilocybin-based curiosities. We'll be taking your calls all night at 512-686-0279. That's 512-686-0279. Grace, thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here. I love talking about psychedelics.
Absolutely. So let's start there. How are we defining psychedelics when we're talking about these different types of therapies?
Yeah, so psychedelics is actually kind of not a super defined term. Mm-hmm. There's some things that some people would consider to be a psychedelic, like ketamine, and, some people don't consider that to be a psychedelic. So to me, I consider it to be a psychedelic if it causes an experience that is separate from our normal day-to-day, how we would experience the world. Mm-hmm. So it's a pretty broad term.
Yeah, anything, I guess, that's causing these auditory or visual hallucinations. And we're going to get in, I guess, a little bit to the neurobiology of how it's messing with our minds and sort of rewiring our processes, but
changes perception and
kind of just open to anything in that category. Okay. Well, talk to us about psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. I mean, how are people using these drugs therapeutically?
Yeah, so they have a long history, right? They've used them therapeutically back in the 60s, and then we stopped for a long time, and now the research is just sort of picking back up in it again. So the way that people are using them is through integrating their experiences into their kind of sense of self, really. So the way that you might use it in therapy is if someone comes in and they say that they have an interest in taking mushrooms or LSD, and that's just something that they want to do. The therapist can't say, okay, yeah, great, take this dosage at this time. But you can say, okay, that's an experience you're going to have. What's your intention going in? And we can talk about that in therapy. And how do you want that to integrate later on? How do you want that to affect your being in the world?
Yeah. So the way things are right now with, and we'll talk more about the history and sort of the research and these different things, mm-hmm. but as of right now, there are still all of these kind of moralistic prohibitions, and there are still a lot of laws involved. So people are consuming these things and then maybe just kind of talking to their therapist about their experience and trying to fit that into their daily lives in one way or another.
Right. Just like we would with any other experience. If somebody tells me, hey, I want to go skydiving, then we're going to talk about, okay, what precautions are you taking for going skydiving? Who are you going to go with? When are you going to do it? What are you expecting to get out of the experience? Mm-hmm. All of those things.
Interesting. So I've heard of this before, but I always heard of it in the context of the person who comes in for therapy is tackling a challenge that then they decide will be helped by the use of psychedelics. But you're saying it can also be somebody who wants to try psychedelics who can go to a therapist to get the best prep for that and kind of approach it in a responsible way?
Absolutely. And these can be, people who've already been in therapy for a long time, and then they're going, hey, I did some research and I saw that, people are using psilocybin for depression. What do you think about that?
Okay. Interesting.
You mentioned the example of, jumping out of an airplane, and clearly we can think about all of the therapeutic things that could come out of that brush with death, the excitement, the energy, maybe accomplishing a milestone bucket list, something that you've always wanted to do and having that opportunity. What are the sorts of things that people might take psilocybin for as a way of moving through or processing something?
Yeah. So a big reason is spirituality. These psychedelic drugs have been around for a long, long time as a part of people's spiritual practices, and not necessarily associated with any religion or anything like that, but just as sort of a way to connect with the earth and the universe and whatever else people might want to
Understanding your own
connect with.
part in all of that, sure.
So that's one reason. I mean, people might do it because they've seen the research on it and they're like, hey, this is supposed to help with depression, and that's what I have, and or PTSD or whatever else. So I think there's a lot of reasons. I think that some people are just really open-minded and they want to have all different sorts of experiences in their life, and they're like, well, this is a big one.
Yeah, absolutely. How do these things work? I mean, just the sort of basic neurology, why might it be an effective therapy?
So basically, most of them work on your serotonin system. You might, know serotonin because it is what we are trying to change when people take antidepressants. So SSRIs are serotonin reuptake inhibitors and selective serotonin
Right.
inhibitors. But so this is working on the exact same system, but in a different way. When you take an SSRI, you're slowly increasing your serotonin levels over time. When you take a psychedelic drug like psilocybin or LSD, you're getting a big old burst of serotonin all at once. And that kind of goes into this whole default mode and network thing that I love talking about. I don't know if you want me to jump in with it right now.
Please. I mean, when we're talking about depression from a clinical standpoint, a lot of theories focus on the fact that depression is kind of caused by or correlated with or connected to this sort of mental rigidity, just being sort of stuck in our ways, knowing that this is it, this is all life can be, this is as good as it's going to get. And that kind of attitude is something we associate with depression. So this is disrupting that somehow.
Yes, and that comes down to that our brain is full of these pathways. It's all these different pathways. When we use a certain pathway really frequently, our brain goes, hey, that pathway must be important. I'm going to put this fancy little myelin sheath around it so that it's super easy for you to get to that thought when you see a brick or whatever it is, whatever kind of association we're forming. When we're a baby and we're born, we don't have any associations with anything. We're just looking around at the world going, okay, all right, this is new, this is interesting. And as we grow and develop and have experiences and have people tell us different things, we kind of get this sense of, okay, this is good, this is bad. I like this, I don't like this. This is who I am, this is not who I am. And the more that develops as we get older, that kind of becomes our default mode network. And that's kind of a relatively new term in psychology and in neuroscience, but it's interesting because we can actually see it on an fMRI. We can see someone's default mode. So for someone who has anxiety, their default mode might be to worry about things. Something happens, they don't get a text back from someone and they go, oh my God, this person died. And that's part of their default mode.
That basic assumption, that knee-jerk reaction.
And what they find is that people who have anxiety, depression, OCD, PTSD, their default mode network is kind of an overdrive. So everything that happens, they have this really tight lens, and everything is seen through this way that they've developed over time. Those pathways are really, really strong, and it's hard for them to use any other pathways or even recognize that there are other pathways. For someone whose serotonin levels are a little bit higher, you might have that knee-jerk reaction, oh my gosh, this person might be dead. And then you might go, that's silly. No, they're probably stuck in traffic because this is Austin.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the basis of the default mode network. And psychedelics basically turn that off temporarily.
So when we associate psychedelics with creativity, it's at least in part because we're approaching the world with kind of new eyes instead of just making all of these assumptions and going to just sort of the default setting on everything.
Right. We have access to all these other pathways in our brain that normally we might just not be able to see, to realize that they're there.
Interesting.
Are there any dangers to this kind of work?
Certainly, yeah. Which I think is, a big reason of why the research got shut down. Well, part of the reason why the research got shut down initially. There's dangers to doing psychedelics in general, just like there's dangers to skydiving. If you're not in the appropriate setting and state of mind and all of those things, it can go poorly, and that could have a negative impact on your mental health.
Yeah, so what we're talking about here is going into approaching psychedelics with the right mindset and then making sure that you're in a good setting, in a safe environment, not, necessarily taking them out at a crowded park, even though it might be beautiful and that might feel nice. Everything can go wrong there as opposed to in a safe place at home or something along those lines.
Sure. Or like doing it at a concert or, a festival.
Something chaotic.
Like that, where a lot of people experience psychedelics for the first time. Because we are opening ourselves up to these new pathways, and there's no guarantee that they're going to be more pleasant than the pathways that are already there. So there's definitely cautions that need to be taken.
So do you mind if I ask what the difference is then between, if we're talking about the pathways themselves being a factor, what is the difference between a good trip and a bad trip?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's a really subjective experience, right? What might be a good trip to someone else might not be for a different person, because we're opening ourselves up to parts of ourselves that we might not have explored before, right? So if there's some trauma or something there that's kind of deep, if that comes up to the surface, that can be scary and overwhelming. You can work through that, especially if you have a safe person there with you who's willing to work through that. And what seems like a bad trip at first can become a good trip as you kind of get through that. I was watching Gwyneth Paltrow's Goop show. Yeah, I know there's a lot of controversy around this show. But the first episode, they are exploring psychedelics. So I was like, okay, I have to watch it. And I thought they did a really good job. I mean, I was really amazed by the individuals doing it, to be so brave and vulnerable, to go on this show and really, just show everyone their super intense trip on mushrooms. But it kind of showed that whole process of at first it was really fun and they're all laughing, and then it's like, oh shit, I'm processing my dad's death now, and really intense stuff. And some might say that was a bad trip. And if you're in the wrong setting and you have no choice but to go sit in the bathroom and wait it out, that's probably going to stay bad. Okay. But if you have someone there to give you love and compassion and tell you it's going to be okay and you're strong enough and you can handle it, that's a good positive experience.
Okay. I've got so many questions.
Yeah. One of the important aspects of being safe and careful with these drugs is remembering that, your normal regulatory systems are kind of offline. And so if you start to have a bad thought or a bad mood, you can stay as miserable and moody as long as you're holding on to that train or that particular thought. But because your default settings are kind of offline, it's very quick and easy to switch over so long as you have, the right training or the right accomplice with you.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to ride out that bad trip, and not necessarily try to distract yourself from that or have someone distract you from it, but to really, and I think that's where the therapeutic aspect comes into, in a way that we can't do here because it's not legal, but in this show they do it because they're in another country.
Sure.
And the therapists are there to really support them through that and help them kind of understand why and how those things are coming up in that moment.
Interesting.
Well, I definitely want to talk a little bit more about sort of the history of these things and why it is illegal in this country and what we can maybe hope for in the future. But before we jump into any of that, I'd love to jump on the phones and touch base with Brutus. Brutus, you're on the air. What can we do for you?
Howdy. So I'm a little bit nervous because this is a very touchy subject right now in our culture.
Sure.
But basically, and this does actually relate a little bit to what you guys are talking about with anxiety, depression, PTSD, etc. Because I personally am kind of a jumbled mess of all of those since a pretty young age. As a result, I actually my dating life completely shuts down unless if I'm taking enough CBD oil and doing other stuff to kind of emotionally regulate myself. But despite that, I'm a pretty experienced guy when it comes to a lot of sexual avenues, despite the fact that I have so much anxiety. Some of that comes from my history with swinging. Some of that, unfortunately, comes from a little bit of a history with pickup artistry. And I'm glad I don't do that because it's just not healthy for, especially the person who's actually using it. But it taught me a lot about male anxiety and the fact that I don't feel like a lot of men are well prepared for a lot of the changes that have very suddenly happened. And this is why you're getting angry red pill guys and people who are hyper suspicious of women and just the opposite sex in general, because you do have a little bit of the extreme on the other end here and there.
Yeah, you're talking about guys just sort of adjusting to this new Me Too landscape in which women have more of a voice and more of an opportunity to, I guess, to speak out against their frustrations that have existed for a long time. Is that, do I kind of have the right of it?
Yeah, some of that, but also just some of the harm that purity culture has done. We've suppressed women sexually so long that women kind of don't have a good sense of communicating their needs. And as a result, men often don't understand them, or men will just assume that women just aren't that into sex, and that because they aren't into sex, that it becomes very transactional. It becomes very, well, I bought you a drink, so I should get your phone number and I should get a date, or I bought you dinner, I should at least get a hand job or whatever. And because a lot of men, on an intuitive level, even if they know that women are also into sex, there's still that little bit of an intuitive disconnect. And I think that's how you get a lot of nice guys who will be like, well, I did this nice thing and this nice thing and it didn't go anywhere. And they'll almost act like they got passed up for a promotion at a job by a new person because they don't fundamentally understand certain things. But also, there's a lot of cultural conditioning that, ironically, I think causes men to almost devalue themselves subconsciously. One thing that I've learned that's very interesting. Going from I was, because of the stuff I mentioned earlier, not very successful from being a kid to a teenager to now today I've been with over 40 women. Not that that's some big thing to be proud of or something that shows value, but that I've been around. And one thing that I've noticed is, despite the fact that a lot of men make it out like women are very picky, women are very demanding and that sort of thing, women don't really seem to be all that picky, or it doesn't really take that much. But the problem is that we have so many internalized anxieties, and it can come out in so many different ways.
Yeah, I see a lot of these tensions in the culture and people just learning how to communicate better. Certainly, I mean, we've made it our mission in many ways to be part of that solution. But I very much see the problems that you're describing. What kind of questions or maybe insight did you have for us?
Well, I'm trying to figure out basically some sort of therapeutic, almost like, and a therapeutic alternative to like dating coaches and sort of the douchebaggy pickup artist, red pill, etc. stuff that I dipped my toes in, unfortunately, and kind of want to get my toes back. But and sometimes it's not even just a matter of knowing things. Like if my anxiety is high, I tend to get ghosted a little bit more. If I have a friend with benefits, she'll sort of not be as, she'll start having other things to do or something, or whoever it is that I'm seeing. Whereas with my anxiety is a little bit lower for whatever reason, like a year ago, I found out that I was taking half the pills I was supposed to be taking. And once I started taking the full dose, my dating life kind of exploded. But there's just so many little things like that where there are these small bits of anxiety, that men develop over time. There are these small issues, and even if you're not outright saying or doing something wrong, if your head's in the wrong space, you can end up in a situation where you just kind of have an invisible bubble around you. But if you're in the right state of mind, it feels like you could kind of say whatever you want.
Yeah, I definitely hear that. I think you're hitting on the important part of all of this is that, I will say that there are ethical dating coaches. They certainly exist. We've had some lovely ones on this show. But I hear what you're saying about this sort of pickup culture and how it's window dressing, how it's just trying to treat a problem, treat the symptom of something, when really it is about this more internalized anxiety, and it is about these more deeply rooted issues. So, from there, I would say that as best as you're able, learning to either cope with or process and work through that anxiety, and that may mean working with a therapist or something along those lines.
Which could be attachment related, or, a therapist might come at it from that perspective. And also bringing in practicing expressing needs. You mentioned that women have a lot of trouble expressing needs, which is absolutely true, and men have the same troubles it shows up in a different way.
Sure. And I'll say to you, Brutus, just in our brief conversation as a stranger on the internet who's not trying to tell you about yourself, but I do hear a lot of the sort of the more rigid thinking that we've been talking about here at the top of the show. And I think that is going to be something that plays into your anxiety if you have these sort of assumptions about women are this way, men are that way, they interact in these ways. Rather than seeing the individual and the experience as it relates to that particular moment. Now, I again don't mean to assume that that's generalized around your life, but just in this conversation, I think that's something to be aware of. And so I would encourage you to maybe be working with a therapist around this anxiety and some of these fears.
Yeah, that's something that I think everybody deals with at some point to some degree.
Absolutely.
And I had to fight a little bit. 2 months ago, I walked out of an abusive relationship. And
congratulations.
And of course, right after you have a relationship, half the species sucks in your head for a day or so.
Sure.
But I knew that it was a pretty irrational thing, and it was a little bit of just general bitterness, and some people who repeatedly have very toxic influences and hear very toxic things over and over again develop an almost adversarial attitude.
Yeah.
As a defense.
And again.
No, that's certainly true, and I'm glad to hear that you're out, and that it sounds like you have access to good care and good treatment. So I would really encourage you to be processing these things, to be working on those underlying issues rather than just the surface of how do I be charming on a date, how do I impress a woman when I first meet her, those kinds of questions, because they're not going to serve you as well or as importantly as actually taking care of these big parts of yourself. So I hope that gives you a place to start. Yeah,
and a lot of the window dressing, one thing that I found was that with, the pickup stuff, like it worked with like just general women you'd run into, but where it failed was around swingers, kinksters, and women who were much more open and out and direct about sex.
I would say and informed and communicative, which is an important distinction on why these strategies are so problematic, is they often prey on folks that feel oppressed, that don't feel comfortable or confident speaking up for themselves or asking for what they want. And I'm very proud and glad to say that folks in the kink community and the poly community and some of these other places are more equipped, more prepared, more educated on how to express themselves.
I always felt like it's more, people are so, everything's just a little bit under the surface. Whereas with those, and that's kind of what a lot of the stuff that I was using, it was more sort of just framing myself as the alpha or the guy that people like or something like that. Whereas in those kinds of communities, they're very savvy. They can, where some woman you meet on campus or some woman you meet at a bar or something like that will kind of giggle and play with their hair and respond just kind of over time with women who are more savvy and sexual, who are the types of women I generally see.
And we're certainly working to help create a world where every woman on every campus is as savvy and equipped as every woman at every munch or poly meetup or whatever. So,
there's so many things that I think that I've learned from being around kinksters and dating a lot of people who are into that I think the vanilla world could learn from, especially when it comes to consent. Like that's also a big anxiety-inducing point for just about everyone, and it sucks for everybody. And it's a very very important thing to figure out and get right. Right now, one thing that I'm doing with my life is that I'm usually avoiding long-term relationships because I do kind of want to wander around being single to basically learn more about myself, learn more about other people, and basically how I could kind of, because I want to be somebody who is a little bit more someday become a dating coach, but be one that's kind of a healthy alternative to that sort of thing. Or since I'm also a psych major, I wanted to figure out if maybe there's some way to develop a therapy for people who do have these issues.
And there are a number of them, and I welcome you to the field. I'm glad that you are working on these issues because I do speak to men all the time in my practice that feel like if they just had an opportunity to get to know somebody, that they would be able to wow them, but they don't necessarily know how to make that introduction. So there is something to be said about getting your foot in the door and being, smooth and charming without necessarily being sleazy or trying to pick somebody up or seeing them as an object. And our culture hasn't always done a great job. Our culture has done a terrible job, in fact, of navigating these issues. So, we're certainly on this show committed to being a part of the solution. I'm glad to hear that we have you with us. I do want to go ahead and jump on another call that we have waiting on the line, but I'm so glad to hear from you and to hear that you're joining us.
Yeah, I'm glad to talk to you guys, and this is a major societal issue that I feel like we need to get right. Because we are, if the sexual revolution was the American Revolution, we're in the Wild West, and we're settling, and we're kind of settling something better now.
I hear that. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. I hope you have a great night.
You too. I'm gonna hop back in the chat.
Sounds good.
Please do. Yeah, I do love hearing that, and I love that idea that women who are out about their sexuality, who are studying their sexuality, who are having conversations and being in community about their sexuality are less likely to fall prey to a bunch of bullshit and abuse.
Yeah, definitely. I also think that I would caution the generalization that kinky people are inherently more sexual than
That's certainly true.
other people,
Yeah.
or that if you are one of those people who feels more comfortable playing with your hair at a bar, listening to someone like flirt with you, that somehow is like stunted sexual growth.
That flirting is inherently immature.
Yeah, like it doesn't quite track for me that's as can be piled as neatly into those two boxes as maybe would be first thought.
I think that's a good clarification for sure.
There's so much that goes into dating in general.
Yeah, I mean, we're here for an hour and a half every week, and we're barely scratching the surface, to be sure. So, okay, well, with that, as much as I would love to jump back into it, I want to make sure to take this call from Eric here in Texas. Eric, howdy, you're on the air.
Hello, how's everybody doing tonight?
Doing pretty great. What can we help you with?
So I had a question for the guest.
Mm-hmm.
Y'all were talking about the benefits of taking certain psychedelics, right?
Sure. Mm-hmm.
So in my experience, I have plenty of friends who, like stoner friends who kind of tout the medicinal benefits of weed to be this cure-all for everything. Hey, you got glaucoma? Weed. Cancer? Weed. Parkinson's disease? Weed. And
I think we all know that guy or have like been at a barbecue with that guy.
Or gal. Yeah.
And they sit back and, I read a study that every major disease can be cured by weed. And so I think that there's this danger of, touting the medicinal benefits that we've been able to prove versus what we've been able to see so far in studies. And my question is, are any of these benefits of psychedelics being overly kind of touted? Should we worry about that? I know that you mentioned goop, and there have been plenty of really unsavory people who've sold, products that have been physically dangerous to people on that website. Right. And so my question is, how do you get away from that? How do you make sure that what you're using and what you're giving people has been shown to work?
Sure. I think that the biggest thing that stands out to me is people, reading this research and everything and then just going, okay, great, I'll start doing mushrooms every day, or I'll start microdosing, which is another, thing that's like very out
form
there
of consumption.
and people are kind of using as a cure-all. So that's the thing that worries me most about it, because that's not really doing it in a way that could be therapeutic. And maybe it is therapeutic for some people, but it can certainly be very dangerous as well. I think the research right now is still so fresh and new, and it's still pretty counterculture, I guess, to buy into it at this point, that I'm not terribly worried about it. But it's definitely a concern that I have going forward, is that it will become like marijuana and just this, oh yeah, you're depressed? Take mushrooms. Easy. Done.
Right.
Sort of a thing.
And we'll definitely talk a little bit more about the research, but I would tell you, Eric, that right now there's very little of like good modern research. It's being built up at a rapid rate, and the early returns are overwhelmingly positive, which should give us all a little bit of hesitation. Sure. It's really exciting, but also more validation of that evidence needs to be followed up on. But I think the bigger, broader question that we're going to attempt to tackle a little bit here is why we haven't been doing this research for the last 50 years. Because we may very well find 5 years from now that we really missed the boat, that there's not a lot of value here, and that perhaps there isn't a lot to be done, or it was a lot of placebo. But there's so much pointing away from that. There's so much suggesting that this is likely of incredible value, and it has gone completely unexamined for generations, in large part because of a lot of moralizing bullshit.
Well, and I think it's important that we, at the very least, are researching it, because our current methods of treating depression and PTSD and OCD aren't great.
Yeah, no, absolutely not.
SSRIs don't really work very well.
And they seem to be working less well than they did, which is very baffling and frustrating.
And benzodiazepines are commonly prescribed for anxiety. They're very addictive. They're very dangerous if they're mixed with alcohol or, so
Sure.
I think that we need more options and that it only makes sense to try and research the things that potentially might work. And psychedelics are one of those.
Entirely agree.
Yeah. So,
Yeah, I mean, I kind of want to echo Christy's point that, this puritanical society has kind of created this fear of the unknown, especially when it comes to drugs like that. And, the war on drugs really didn't help. But I guess now that we're looking at things and we're trying to get a clear sense of it for the lay person, if they're looking at this and they're trying to investigate, they're trying to take a skeptical view and kind of assess the danger and the benefits and things like that, how should they approach this? How should somebody kind of look at this and be objective?
Sure. There's a lot of really great research out there. There's some pretty cool TED Talks for those who don't really want to read, a research study about it. Google Scholar is a great source to find the studies for those people who do really want to sit down and read the research. It's accessible and out there, and I'm sure the authors would be happy for more people to read it.
Sure. And I guess what I would suggest to you, Eric, is that, if your stoner brother comes and starts hassling you and trying to shove mushrooms in your face, maybe don't take it as seriously. But also, while there are risks and dangers to these things, the condition that we're trying to cure, the thing that we're looking to solve, the problem that we're looking to fix is one of personal experience. It's one of depression and anxiety. And yeah, we do have some very crude ways of measuring that, but should you be interested, should you safely and in appropriate and responsible ways pursue these options, at the end of the day, you will either feel better or you will not feel better. And that is going to be the ultimate form of research for you and your experience. Mm-hmm. Now, before we start prescribing...
That's kind of all the options, isn't it?
It really is. And you can get there on your own. Now, when we talk about like research and marketing these things and prescribing them wholesale to large groups of people, we want good, valid science that overwhelmingly presents the idea that there is an incredible likelihood that this will solve a problem. But when we're talking right now about individuals and their personal experience, if you feel less depressed, you are less depressed. And it might be because of the mushrooms. It might be because you thought that the mushrooms would help. It might be because you took the mushrooms and had a really good day and that made your depression go away. So whether we want to identify the method of action, we want to understand how these things work. We want to do research and see if they work on everybody or on large groups of people. We want that information. We just simply don't have it right now. So if anybody says that they do, don't listen or examine what they're saying very, very closely and very skeptically. But when you're talking about your own experience, statistics don't matter. Your personal experience of anxiety, your personal experience of depression, your personal experience of these things is going to be dictated by how you feel. And so I would encourage you to safely and responsibly and legally and ethically pursue what makes you feel better.
Yeah.
Sure, and as somebody who has experimented with psychedelics safely, I did get a lot of benefit out of it. And part of that benefit came after I, had an evening that I was communing with my ceiling fan. But I just want to make sure that we're, understanding that experience, while there can be a placebo value to it, we just got to be careful that we're not accidentally ascribing a medicinal value that hasn't yet been fully fleshed out.
Absolutely.
Yeah, fair point. No, I appreciate you calling in with that.
Talking to
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Take care. Yeah, so these are very good points and kind of what I wanted to get into next, which is how did we get here where, there was so much exciting, promising research in the 50s and 60s, and then it was immediately stopped, and now we're starting to dig into it again? I mean, can you walk us through a little bit more of the history on these things?
Yeah. So, I'm not a historian.
Sure, yeah.
But from my understanding, LSD kind of, it wasn't really a thing so much before like 1960.
I think it was discovered in 1956. Somebody on the internet can get me on that, but synthesized, invented, whatever the appropriate terminology would be.
Yeah, very accidentally.
Yes.
Somebody made this and they got some on themselves and then biked home and started having a very interesting and scary bicycle ride because he had no idea what was happening or what was going on.
Which is a really terrifying notion.
Yes.
To think, like, not only are you having this acid trip, but you were in no way prepped to have an acid trip, and also no one else has ever had an acid trip.
Yes.
So here you go.
Terrifying experience. So he went home and, he was a scientist. So he's journaling about this and trying to make note of his experience.
And we're talking about Albert Hoffman here?
I think he tried this 1 or 2 more times, and that was it. Because I remember reading, somebody asked him, like, oh, well, you must have done LSD thousands of times. And he was like, no, 3 times.
That's enough for me. That was 1938.
1938?
Yeah.
Is that true? Okay, my mistake.
But it took it a while before it made its way to the United States. Then it made its way to the United States and was, of course, a huge part of just hippie culture. And I think it really makes a lot of sense because, one, the people who are going to try psychedelic drugs are pretty open-minded people. And 2, doing psychedelic drugs, like we were talking about, opens up your mind in a lot of ways. So it really fit in with their whole peace, love, mission,
counterculture
and with
talking
their
points.
values. At the same time, it was being researched in the world of psychology, and people like Timothy Leary are trying to figure out how to use it as part of therapy, and they're taking it with their patients, and it's this whole thing.
Yeah, some more responsibly than others, we should point out.
Definitely. And there was some solid research that came out at that time, and there was also a lot of research that was not by any standard of what we would call research today. And at the same time, the CIA is like, interesting, a drug that makes people behave in different ways and say things that they might normally say.
Keeps teenagers from going to war like they're supposed to.
Yeah. And so they start doing their own research on it as well. And I mean, it was not okay. They did a lot of stuff that we know now, like putting some LSD on someone and following them through the rest of the day, and they had no consent. The people had no idea what was happening to them. Of course they have a bad trip when you just assume that you're going crazy in the middle of your Tuesday.
Sure.
Gosh.
Yeah, so all of this stuff is happening, and eventually it's just like the government is like, enough is enough. We don't like these hippies, and we don't like that they're doing this LSD and blah, 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 blah. And so they stop all the research. They stop everything that's happening, and no more LSD.
Yeah, so it was all...
Or marijuana.
Yeah, at the same time. So it was a lot of just sort of backlash against people, I guess, sort of rebelling against the establishment and getting mixed up into the counterculture. And the actual research that was being done was sort of a casualty of that.
Absolutely. Yeah, so we didn't get to see what would really happen or what kind of effects these drugs would have because the government didn't. I mean, I don't think the government really wants people to be very open-minded in general.
That's a fair consideration. Yeah,
scary.
especially at a time where there are unpopular wars. And I mean, we don't have to rehash the 60s as a couple of millennials, but certainly we understand that history that went into it. what has led to, I guess, this kind of recent resurgence? It does feel like all of a sudden there are papers being published, I mean, just daily now about these issues.
Yeah, well, I don't think that it was anything we were doing here in the U.S. I mean, MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies.
Wow, very nice. Very well done.
Thank you. Practiced. They have been around for a while, and they've been pushing and pushing and pushing for more research on psychedelics. So I think that they've done a lot of great work. But from what I've found, the most recent resurgence of research came from the UK. Mm-hmm. And they started looking at psilocybin, and that kind of opened the door. They had some really promising results. And then, like, one university, I think it was somewhere in the Northeast, they researched the effects of people dying of cancer taking psilocybin in order to cope with their anxiety about death. And I guess that the government was cool with that because they're like, oh, these people are dying.
Cancer.
Yeah.
Everybody's uncomfortable, so might as well. Okay.
Yeah. So that was some of the first research that was done here, and it helped people a lot with their anxiety about death.
Interesting.
It's beautiful to hear. Now that things are kind of starting to churn along a lot more quickly, I mean, Eric hit on it, we are getting better data. What sort of hopes or maybe expectations do you have for the future of research, for the future of treatment, and hopefully maybe even the future of legalization or just more appropriate and less reactionary legislation?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that we are making progress. My biggest hope is just that research will continue.
Sure.
We need more of it. We need more of it to be able to see if it's anything that is viable for treatment. Mm-hmm. So that's my only hope. I try not to get as far as like how, it would come into the therapy room or anything like that, because
until we understand what it is we're talking about.
Mm-hmm. At least a little bit more, as much as we understand anything that happens in the brain.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, fair to say. Well, and it
kind of a mystery.
I feel like we kind of missed an opportunity here to point out that LSD specifically is something that really taught us about how the brain works in terms of before Hoffman's, happy accident, mm-hmm. we didn't really recognize that such incredibly small doses of a chemical could have such incredible impact on the way our brains function. And that sort of opened our eyes to all of these neurotransmitters and our modern understandings of serotonin and epinephrine and all of these different things that we really weren't aware of in any kind of meaningful way before this.
Absolutely. We wouldn't have SSRIs if somebody didn't figure out that, oh, hey, there's this serotonin thing.
Or even just the notion of psychotropic medication sort of came out of this, and that's certainly a mixed bag, but mm-hmm. hopefully progress.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So why do you think that psychedelics in particular have been so slow to, I guess, become polite conversation, to become accepted? I mean, they've been such a boogeyman for a long time. And I mean, you mentioned Timothy O'Leary and, some of these other negative moments, but it feels like it's still a heavily, heavily stigmatized substance.
Absolutely. I feel like part of it is because we still have so much stigma around mental illness. Mm-hmm. And to an outsider, someone who is tripping on acid might look like a crazy person.
Yeah.
They're seeing things that aren't
point.
there. They're hearing things that maybe aren't there. They're perceiving things in a different way. So that's scary.
Well, also, weren't we sold for a long time that this is your brain on drugs situation, that like, oh, you will go crazy if you do this. Like, doing this once is basically saying goodbye to being sane ever again.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, man, if you watch any movie where somebody smokes pot previous to like 2000, they were actually having like hallucinogenic type characteristics. Like if you watch somebody in a 90s movie smoke weed, they are portraying it as if they had done psychedelics, which I guess is just another way of saying that's what we associate with like the bad effects of drugs.
Mm-hmm. And it seems like, our culture will swing one way and then swing very strongly the other. And so we had all these people who were very pro-drug in a lot of ways and pro-psychedelics and doing them. And then the next generation is like, oh my gosh, that was terrible. Drugs are horrible. Stay far, far away from those. Mm-hmm. They're frying your brain. They're killing brain cells.
Technically, though, aren't the people who were doing drugs in the 60s the people who are making the legislation now?
Yes and no. If you were doing psychedelics in the 60s, I don't know that you're holding office, generally speaking. And so there's a little bit of self-selection there. I think it's also worth pointing out, I don't have the number in front of me, but I feel like I read recently that as of like 1968 or something very much along those lines, something like less than 5% of Americans had even smoked marijuana, let alone tried a psychedelic. So those people were growing up witnessing the harassment of a tiny, tiny minority and, being a part of it, basically, like hearing all of the fear-mongering and everything else. Now they're in government and they still haven't tried it because... Right. Whereas, nowadays, with so many states legalizing marijuana, there is much greater access to it, and people are kind of looking around going like, nobody's died. Like, it seems to be fine.
Well, that's a common theme recently. It feels like there was a piece of legislation, I think, in Ohio that got passed that required ectopic pregnancies to be reimplanted into the uterus, which is not a thing that can happen ever. Like, we don't have the technology to do that. And when asked about it, he's like, I'm not a doctor. How would I know? I just wrote the law. So, like, they're not even reading the research. They're not consulting anybody. So, of course, this is going to be something that they just, this seems bad to me, so I'm going to get rid of it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, before we get back to the interview, I wanted to tackle an email that we got a couple of weeks ago that I've been really wanting to discuss, but we just haven't found the right moment. And so I'd love to read this out for y'all and I guess just hear y'all's reaction, if I may. It just starts, hello. After attending Catholic school ages 5 to 18, I eventually deconverted and began identifying as an atheist. Though I've done a lot of work unpacking and unlearning the shame of sex and sexuality, I internalized because of Catholicism. There is one thing still really impacting me: fear of getting pregnant. I don't want to have children, and my partner and I take precautionary measures. We use condoms, and I take the pill, but the risk still terrifies me, and it impacts how much I enjoy sex. It makes me anxious. I remember in 8th grade, a classmate's mom visited our class to talk about what she sees as a labor and delivery nurse. She said, "Don't be that 14-year-old in labor. Don't be that girl." I'm not a teen anymore, but I still think this haunts me. I also live in a state with strict abortion access. Who doesn't? I lived in a state with strict abortion access with mandatory ultrasounds and 24-hour waiting periods. Every election cycle, abortion access is a hot topic, usually motivated by the Christian right. What if I get pregnant and can't access an abortion? My question, is there a way to overcome this fear so that it's no longer impacting how I have sex? Is there a way to address how our legal system is influencing my fear?
Yeah, that is those are big questions. Those are questions that I think we could talk about for an entire show.
No question. I mean, just the reality that every time these things are being discussed on the news and it becomes this political football where the left is yelling at the right and people are going back and forth, we forget how much that progress or that effort towards progress can be incredibly triggering to folks, to just be having these conversations for the 10,000th time, to be witnessing these things.
Sorry, I haven't forgotten.
Yeah.
I'm experiencing those triggers daily.
I hear that.
No, I think that's it's very rings true to me. I also grew up with the fear of God and pregnancy kind of drilled into me. There are other reasons now that I would dislike being pregnant. I think it would cause me massive amounts of gender dysphoria, for one. But also, it's not something I ever want to do, and I've never wanted it. So when I was starting to have sex when I was late teens, early 20s, I was calling Planned Parenthood after every sexual encounter. I was on the pill. I had planned beforehand, got on the pill. We always used condoms. Like, we were doing all the things right. And every single time, I spent a fortune in pregnancy tests. Just every single time I had sex, I was like, okay, I have to wait a week, and then I'm going to pee on this stick and hope and, like, be anxious about it. It was a real hurdle to get over. I would suggest that you do call your local Planned Parenthood, because they do have nurses on call that will answer any questions, and they were really, really great. They talked me through everything. Yes, that's normal. This is what you should do if you think that, maybe you need to take the morning after pill, come in for this test or that test. They were really, really great with me. So I definitely suggest just having them on your phone as someone you can call if you can't talk to anybody else about it, like I couldn't. Also, I mean, it gets easier as you have more sex, honestly. For me, it's not something I'm worried about anymore, or as much, just because that was like the first shock of, oh, I'm doing this thing, and I've been taught that it always ends in a tragic way. And that way is most often pregnancy, which, by the way, is like it's a weird double thing that, like, pregnancy is the worst thing that could possibly happen to you until it's the best thing that could possibly happen to you.
Until, like, you're expected to.
Right. And then why aren't you getting pregnant? Like, clearly this is the best thing.
Do not get pregnant until you're 18, and then get pregnant immediately.
But only if you're married.
Right. Well, I mean, get married at 17. This is... Where did you grow up?
Fair.
Come on.
Fair. So, yeah, I think the two things I would say as somebody who's been there is talk to people, especially people who are certified to talk about this kind of thing. Planned Parenthood worked for me. And also to just realize that this is a trigger that has been implanted in you. It is part of your indoctrination, and it is going to take time to get over it. But I believe that you can. I think that as you continue to have sex and as you continue to normalize this part of your life, which is a great part of your life, that it's going to get less scary, because you're going to be like, okay, all right, you know what to do now. You know that things work. We've proven that these things work most of the time. So yeah, I'd say those are my two suggestions for that.
Mm-hmm. I hope it's also helpful just to have written that out and share it with someone. Oftentimes that helps a lot. And just to know that that is a normal fear that so many women feel, especially when they first start having sex, and for a lot of people after they've been having sex for a while. So you're not alone in that.
Yeah, I feel like the two of you really hit on the important components. The first being sort of the conventional wisdom that by exposure, by sort of managing your circumstances, I mean, you're on the pill, you're using condoms, you're in good shape. You're maybe overkill, in fact, and that's okay too. If it makes you feel more comfortable, you can still buy Plan B on Amazon for like $15. Have it on hand.
Yes, but also, this is something I learned. Don't take Plan B and then continue to take your birth control at the same time, because that can do weird counteracting things. So, yeah. So if you're taking regular birth control pill and you also take Plan B, that can actually make it, like, mess up the cycle more than help, like, bolster it. So
there are a number of different types of morning after pills, and so certainly, call your Planned Parenthood, talk to your OBGYN. I mean, get whatever around you need to feel comfortable, and like V was saying, through a little bit of exposure and creating this safe environment, a lot of those fears will begin to fade. But Grace, I hear what you're saying too, because sort of the conventional wisdom is that with practice, with experience, these fears will go away. And as we learn more about trauma, we recognize that while that's typically true, it's also very possible if you are having those re-exposures in a tense, anxious kind of state that you can become sort of re-traumatized, and it becomes cyclical and builds on itself. And one of the best ways to dispel that is to be having these conversations, is to be, just putting your thoughts on paper as a place to start, but also saying these things out loud. And beyond that, talking to a therapist or something else to get sort of at the root of a lot of these fears and pains and some of the trauma there. So, of course, at moments like this, we like to mention the Secular Therapy Project through Recovering from Religion, as well as their hotline for not medical advice on how to avoid pregnancy, but on how to be human and how to cope with those feelings as they're coming up. So I definitely want to direct you to both of those resources as well.
Also, definitely make sure that whoever you're having sex with, you've had the talk about what would happen if you did get pregnant, because a lot of the time that can also be a compounding fear.
Sure.
At least for me growing up, being around guys who had also grown up Christian and who had also grown up very fundamentalist, that was the added fear of, oh no, what if I get pregnant and they don't agree with how I want to handle things. So even just knowing that your partner will be there for you and be like, yeah, we're going to go for an abortion and get an ice cream afterwards. It's fine.
Or I'll support you in whatever decision you want to make. It's
exactly.
your body, it's your choice.
Yeah, exactly.
Having those conversations beforehand.
Yes. Yeah.
And even just letting them know if you feel comfortable, depending on your partner and the dynamics of that relationship, having somebody else who's in the room who just is aware of the fact that you're having these fears, who can look at you during that afterglow and recognize that you're feeling anxious and say like, hey, I understand that you're feeling kind of nervous about this, but just to remind you, we got it. It's all taken care of. We're going to be fine. I'm here by your side. Letting them in on your fears as you feel comfortable, I think, is a really powerful way to sort of name those fears and then tame them as a result.
Absolutely. I was going to say, name it to tame it.
Ah, goddamn. Too many therapists in one room. Okay, so with that, we've talked a little bit about psilocybin and these other things, how they can affect sort of the LDP, how they affect what you called the default mode network and these different things. How is any of that useful in sex-based therapies or in just becoming more comfortable around some of these sex anxieties?
Yeah, so I mean, like I talked about with the pathways in our brain, like if you have certain pathways that are in place around sex, then shifting those pathways could be helpful. I was thinking about it recently when it comes to role play. Mm-hmm. And I was just thinking about how when you're a kid, it's so easy to play. Just to dive in and...
The games don't have any rules. You just kind of show up.
Yeah. And I just remember so many instances of my little friends being like, let's play. And that's what we did, whether with Barbies or Build-A-Bears or action figures or baby dolls or literally anything, just... balls on the pool table, right? I would always get in trouble for that one. Play with them.
Don't lose these.
But it was fun until someone had one of their fingers smashed. But so I was thinking about this recently. Why is it so easy for us to play when we're kids? And now, just even the idea of role play, I'm like, how could I possibly take that seriously? And I think it's interesting because I think it's important for us as adults to find some sort of way to incorporate play into our life because it's being creative, it's being fun, it's just like not taking yourself too seriously, right? But so anyway, I was thinking about this, how I mentioned that when we're a kid, we have less of this default mode. We have less of a sense of self in general. So it's easy to drop that and just sort of be someone else. When it comes to psychedelics, it's having that same effect. It's taking on that same effect where you can drop that sense of self and just be whatever you want to be in that moment. And I think that's really helpful when it comes to sex.
Yeah, absolutely. Just getting away from these assumptions and these obligations and remembering that sex is inherently silly.
It is.
You know, I say this to people so often, and I probably drive a portion of our audience crazy. I appreciate the folks who are tuning in every week. But the truth is, this is important. I mean, I have built sort of my career and my life in many ways around helping people to have good sex, while constantly reminding them how unimportant, how silly, how unserious it really ought to be. There's no way that we evolved this incredibly complex and baroque sexuality just to reproduce our species. It's not as simple as that. It's part of the way that we bond with one another. It's part of the way we communicate with one another. And none of that needs to be any more serious than a conversation or a handshake. It's not to say that you can have sex exclusively in a casual way, though that's certainly an option. There can be a lot of depth to it, but even that depth, I mean, the best sex I've ever had has been kind of silly and ridiculous on its surface.
Yeah, I think that life in general is a little bit easier when you're not taking yourself too seriously.
Sure.
And when it comes to sex, there's so many rules that we're taught and, you know, different things that we should feel ashamed about and all that stuff. And in movies, it's often this very serious thing. I was watching Top Gun recently, and that sex scene in there is like intense and passionate and very serious. You know, while Phil Collins is playing.
When in reality, it's just like two pieces of meat slapping against each other, you know? Like, it's not
Hoping
very...
for the best.
Yeah, it's not very decorous from the outside.
Yeah. So, back to psychedelics. You know, I think that makes it easier to not take it so seriously.
Sure. Well, I guess finally, I wanted to ask, what is the difference between working with a therapist, you know, psychedelic-assisted therapy or integrative therapy, or these different perspectives on it, versus just doing drugs? I mean, how do we, kind of as Eric was asking in that call earlier, avoid that pitfall of just being reckless with our bodies or reckless in the way that we take care of ourselves?
Yeah, I want to come back to like the skydiving metaphor of like, you know, people do it on their own and maybe do some research first, maybe not, right? But even the people who do some research, it's kind of like if you were like, okay, well, I need to get this backpack thing that has a parachute in it, and then I need to find a plane somehow and I guess get to like a certain elevation, you know, and then I jump out of it, and then at some point I pull this cord, and that's about it. That's all there is to it, right?
Yeah, and if you are just buying illegal drugs from the guy down the street, it's
right?
a
And he
little
tells
bit
you,
like getting in the back of an airplane.
Take about half of this.
Yeah.
How do I take it? However you want.
Right?
You can do whatever, you know.
Yes, fair point.
So versus going somewhere, taking maybe a brief class, right? And like learning the things that you need to learn, and then having someone there with you, jumping out of the plane with you.
The first several times you do it, you've got somebody like literally strapped to you during that experience.
Yes, making sure that you both make it out safely.
Maybe don't strap yourself to somebody who's doing LSD, but
Don't
the
mix the
metaphor,
two,
not
for sure. Separate adventures.
Well, with that, for folks who are watching, would you have any just tips or advice? Certainly the mindset is to approach this very carefully and with proper instructions. Is there any, knowing that people are going to see this and then have their own experiences and live their own lives and make their own choices, is there anything that you would offer as words of caution or just to let people know how to stay safe?
Yeah, I would offer to practice mindfulness and meditation first to get some skills of just accepting your thoughts and feelings as they come, as you're having them. I use a lot of meditation and mindfulness in my therapy practice and, you know, personally. And what what studies have found through viewing the brain from an fMRI is that someone who practices mindfulness regularly, like we're talking like a lot of mindfulness, like a monk, that's who they've done these studies with, their brain has the same sort of reduced default mode network that we're talking about when it comes to psychedelics. It can be very, that's what you're trying to do with mindfulness, is kind of let go of this sense of ego, let go a little bit of this sense of self, and just be with your thoughts and be with your feelings. And going into any sort of psychedelic journey, you don't want to fight against it. That's where the tension comes in. That's where the battle comes in, is fighting against these thoughts and feelings. So if you have some experience with mindfulness and with meditation, that's going to help you through the psychedelic journey.
Interesting.
Yeah, really well said. Okay, well, with that, I want to encourage everybody to go to gracewoodtherapy.com and check out your blog about mindfulness, as well as another one about psychedelics.
Yes, please.
People can find V at facebook.com/V/VRoseLaBianca, all of your other videos with godless bitches and these other things. I'm on Facebook and Instagram as well as Valence Counseling. I want to thank everybody so much for joining us tonight, for jumping on the Discord, for being in the Facebook groups, as well as the YouTube chat, and just joining us in this community. Of course, we want to make sure to thank everybody in the booth who's made this night possible. Everybody there, thank you so much. And with that, encourage each and every one of you to safely and ethically and responsibly give yourself a big ol' orgasm. Or, better yet, give somebody else one.
What are we doing, man? What are we doing?
No, you're done.